Well, welcome everybody to the 2023 mid-year meeting of the Association for Information Science and Technology. We should congratulate the organizers of the conference that they saved the best material for the last session. And here we are. The session was sponsored by the Special Interest Group in the History and Foundations of Information Science, and it is brought to you by the leadership of that Special Interest Group, by the chair, the vice chair, and the secretary. They're busy right now organizing a splendid set of sessions for the annual meeting. So you'll want to be in London to what these people are doing. The speakers come from 3 different continents, and they're going to address what I consider to be the greatest mystery of information science. Now, when I was young, information science was all about being scientific and applying scientific methods. But by the end of the 20th century, it had somehow morphed into being social sciences, as where the action was and where the attention was. And the great mystery is why a field that's concerned with knowing and learning and meaning, largely populated by people with a background in the humanities, paid so little attention to what the humanities had to offer to information science. Well, our speakers are going to explain. Rather than take up their valuable time with introductions, I will just introduce them very briefly, and more details are in the conference program. We're going to take the order of the program, and we're going to start with Professor Lin Wang, also known as David. He's a distinguished professor and associate dean at Hangzhou Dayanzi University in China. He's written more than 80 papers on a very wide range of topics, and he's currently chair of the ASIS&T History and Foundations of Information Science. And he's going to start us off by talking about philosophical hermeneutics in humanistic foundations of information science. Over to you, David.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Now I will share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen? Hello, can you see my screen right now?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, nice. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. It's my great pleasure to have this opportunity to give a presentation in this panel. The topic of my presentation is philosophical hermeneutics as humanistic foundations of information science. Philosophical hermeneutics is the modern stage of the development of hermeneutics. In the late 1920s, the publication of Martin Heidegger's epoch-making book, Being and Time, made hermeneutics undergo a fundamental shift from epistemology to ontology, thus entering the development stage of philosophical hermeneutics. As the students of Heidegger, Gadamer further believes that interpretation is a process of understanding that generates meanings through the interaction between interpreter and the text, and places great emphasis on the historical, linguistic, and the practical aspects of understanding. In 1960, his book, Truths and Methods, was published, which marks the formation of a complete theoretical system of philosophical hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the inevitable result of the development of humanism spirit in the whole Western world, and is the philosophical basis of humanities studies. In the second half of 19th century, the emergence of the independent consciousness of humanities require breaking the tribalism of natural science and establishing a philosophical foundation for its practice. Modern hermeneutics adapted to this need. At the stage of modern hermeneutics, that is philosophical hermeneutics, the claim that hermeneutics is a philosophy of humanities has been further developed and strengthened in the philosophical hermeneutic stages. And information science essentially has a strong humanistic nature. The introduction of philosophical hermeneutics as the meta theory of the information science discipline has important role in strengthening the humanistic foundation of the discipline. For a long time, contrary to the long-standing humanistic tradition of librarianship, information science adheres to the technical tradition of technological tradition. As Michael Buckland said, there are two traditions in information science. One is a computing tradition, and the other is a document tradition. I think each of them corresponds to the humanistic tradition, technological tradition, respectively. Information compared to a laboratory, information science adheres to the technological tradition, considering itself as a scientific discipline. John Butt wrote in his book, Knowledge and Knowing of Library Science, that the methodology of information science is deterministic scientism in nature. It has some distinctive features like deductive nomenological aspects, reductionism, methodological monism, methodological idealism, and so on. So I think information science now is too hard in the data intelligence age. Not only is hard discipline, but it also there are a lot of algorithms, AI technologies, and other things from computer science, which is very hard for library information science students or scholars to master, I think. So it has two senses of hard. Next is it should be recognized that information science studies the phenomena of information and knowledge in which humans are involved. These social phenomena is fundamentally different from the natural phenomena. As Lu Taihong, a Chinese scholar, pointed out it in the 1990s, information science is a human-centered discipline. However, the nature of humanities has been ignored or forgotten in this field to a large degree. Wrote it these sentences. I think it's very evoking. He said that I would not for a moment suggest that you cease your explorations of the scientific aspects of the information problem, but I'm a humanist, have always been one, and at my age, I'm not likely to change. But I think it is time for the humanists to speak out, to urge you in your work with equations that you do not forget the human equations, which is the most important one of all. Unlike in the United States, French information science research belongs to the disciplines of humanities. I think this is an advantage of French library information science research. Some core concepts in humanities are introduced into information science. Like understanding and interpretations, they are core concepts. Core concept of hermeneutics. Now, information science research has incorporated these two concepts and focused on them. For example, Gao and Xu know that the essence goal of information science are understanding, and information science should reposition as an understanding-oriented discipline. David Borden from London City University believe that in an information intensive environment, understanding the world and human themselves may become the next goal pursued by information science. Information science can develop a humanistic spirit and consolidate the humanistic foundation of the discipline by introducing philosophical hermeneutics. There are several ways of reinvigorating humanistic paradigm in information science. I list some of them. One is human actor-centered conception. A second is emphasizing the importance of historical and social cultural context. The third one is a holistic outlook of subjectivity and objectivity. Last but not least is valuing the tradition and authority in the information science research and practice. I will discuss them briefly. Yeah. First, it's a human actor-centered conception. In fact, at the beginning of the birth of information science, there is a possibility of technology and humanities developing side by side. Bush, in his a famous paper, As We May Think, he put forward some Mamax vision. In his paper, establishing associative trails that simulate human thinking mechanisms is at the core of Mamax. This idea essentially embodies the earliest concept of personalized information services. Now, the recent focus of information science, due to several reasons, the technological transitions was promoted, but the humanistic spirit of Mamax was intentionally or unintentionally ignored. The recent focus of information science has shifted from information artifacts processing to actors and their interactions in the processing. And since late 1980s to 1980s, so 70s to 1980s, with the rise of cognitive viewpoints of cognitive paradigm, human issue has re-entered the mainstream of academic research fields gradually. But there are still some problems of user studies, although users and humans has been attached great importance to. For example, there are standard user modeling which are deeply rooted in the positivism, and the epistemology is ignored. It is sharply contrasted with a humanistic tradition-based hermeneutics methodology. As Berger-Yolen points out, the soft subjective interpretative methods of a humanistic of a hermeneutic nature may recover the ideological basis of the subjective expresses of information need, and thus in the end reflect a more objective reality. As for users' mental models, I think the full structure of hermeneutics can be used as a meta-theoretical framework. Three or four structure of pre-understanding put forward by Heidegger is very useful. It includes for having a foresight and for conception. The fourth structure is at the core of Heidegger's hermeneutics. Actually, there are some theories or viewpoints in our fields are related to the structure, like Bertrand Brooks' knowledge structure, Nicholas Belking's anomalous state of knowledge, actually are related to for conception. And cognitive patterns of users in information research only cover a small part of for insight. As for having, it corresponds to Bergiolin's domain analysis. From the angle of hermeneutics, these theories in information science are not enough to constitute the entire knowledge space of or knowledge horizon of the human actors. Comprehensive users knowledge space should be based on the full structure. Another conception in philosophical hermeneutics is fusion horizons. Fusion horizons lays the foundation for a holistic view of relevance judgment. Relevance research is a core issue in information retrieval and information science, but it has lots of the research on this topic has lasted for several decades, but now it shows a tendency of from complex to perplex. As Michael Buckland points out in his seminal paper, which won the best paper of 10 years of ASIS&T. It is a little wonder that the definitions and the literature on relevance has remained stubbornly problematic for 15 years, despite the sustained efforts of so many talented and motivated researchers. Here, I think a holistic relevance view based on fusion of horizons is needed. When users make relevance judgments, they do not check different types of relevance simultaneously, one by one, as a standard for judgments, but rather use an intuitive way to judge the utility of information items, which is a comprehensive efforts of various types of relevance simultaneously. So distinguishing different relevance types and attributes is often a post hoc thing in the user survey and interview and something like that. So I think that the user's horizon is a holistic knowledge image used for understanding and interpretation as a precondition for user or interpreter to judge the relevance of information. It inherently integrates all elements of information object, human actors, and contexts involved in various types of relevance. The meaning generated by the fusion of users and the text horizons is the basis to directly judge relevance in the real world. The overlap or fusion between the two horizons, that is users and information items horizons, cover the whole spectrum of relevance from the narrowest sense, that is query, to the broadest sense, as is an epistemological type. It is an integrated relevance in complex situations. Other points is that information behavior has ontological implications for human existence, or in Heidegger's word in Germany is Densen. Hermeneutics holds that understanding is the existence model of Densen. Since information seeking and use behavior are essentially the understanding and interpretation process of users, it belongs to the existence mode of Dyson. Information behavior is a manifestation of users' understanding of themselves and the world, in which they obtain transcendence, the existence and ontological foundation of information behavior and information science should attract our attention. Amanda Spink in his book, in her book, holds this view that information behave a similar view as we talked just now. Information behavior is critical for human survival. It is instinctive social cognitive ability of humans and core ability of providing a fundamental framework for human beings to learn and control the environment. Capurro, German information scientist, he believed that the concept of information actually is a fundamental element of interpretation and understanding. So this is also related to our point. And from his view, information in existential hermeneutic sense means to thematically and situationally share a common world. An existential dimension of our being in the world or with others defines what is information.
David, you must finish soon.
Yeah, sure. And another aspect is another way of revirtualizing humanistic spirit is emphasizing the importance of historical and social cultural context. Historical and social contexts are preconditions for our understanding of information behavior, as well as determining factors for meaning generation. Benedictson and landmark Evans, Scarlett, all of these show us the importance of this issue. Michael also point out information science is incorrigibly a cultural and constant with a cultural engagement. Another one is holistic outlook of subjectivity and objectivity. Information is no longer studied as a physical objects and separated from users, knowing as a state, consciousness, and being better informed as a central topic. And the value traditions are authorities, information science research and practice. Cognitive authority from the perspective of hermeneutics is worth exploration in the future. Okay, the last one, conclusion. This presentation explores the humanistic foundation of information science from the perspective of philosophical hermeneutics in the age when intelligence is readily associated with data and science rather than culturally specific methods of human interpretation and understanding. Philosophical hermeneutics research in information science reflects the deepening of the theoretical study and the efforts of constantly inquiring about the nature of the discipline. Peter Inge Watson asked this question on the conceptions of library information science one conference. What kind of humanistic approach is the best key to understanding information transfer and information science research in the sense of epistemology? Our answer is hermeneutics. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Well, we'll move right. We'll have some time for questions at the end and comments. So we're going to move right on to Wayne DeFremery. He's the only person I know who's a professor of information science and entrepreneurship. He's also director of a Center for Global Innovation. He's at Dominican University of California, which is near San Francisco. He's a deep background in both poetry and in bibliography and Korean culture. And he's got a book-length manifesto on the topic of today's presentation that is in production with MIT Press. So look forward to that. Amaze us, Wayne.
Thanks so much. I will absolutely do my best. Thanks to everyone who's up early or up late or just in the middle of the day joining us. I appreciate you being here. So this presentation, and actually the book that Michael refers to, is actually a long and ongoing answer to a question that Michael actually asked many years ago. What might be gained by reinvigorating bibliography? And so what I'd like to do in my time today is sort of stress test several hypotheses. The first is that something can actually be gained by reinvigorating bibliography. I want to think about the idea that systematic, descriptive, analytical, and critical bibliography are integral to practices and modes of thinking in the broad, and it really is a broad and complex and complicated and amorphous field, information science. But that bibliography serves as a kind of infrastructure supporting a field, as opposed to, say, a discipline. And although foundational and foundationally supportive of information science, bibliography is marginal in at least two senses. It's on the periphery, and its means serving often more what are considered more important ends. So it's means serving ends as opposed to the ends being pursued themselves. The bibliography is marginal in the sense, in this sort of old sociological sense, of having many identities. In some contexts, it's called information retrieval. In other contexts, it's called information theory, and yet other contexts, it's called cataloging. So bibliography has all of these sort of different identities and is marginal in that sense. And then sort of the last hypothesis is that reconsidering bibliography, and this is sort of the central thesis, as a foundation of information science can help us to account for how in information science, our practices assert truth and affect belief, how they instantiate knowledge within really complex, evolving socio-technical and cultural systems. So what is to be gained? To sort of jump to the conclusion first, perspective. As David was talking about, hermeneutics has a lot to do with shifting perspectives. So by attending to and reconsidering bibliography, reinvigorating it, the idea is that we can gain a new and renewed attention that helps us to sort of position us to attend to the means, not necessarily ends, but the means that are serving ideas related to truth and belief and knowledge, again, within these evolving systems. So this focus on the means takes us into bibliography, where bibliography is a kind of recursive process that on the one hand creates representations and then attempts to account for the representations that have just been created or have been created previously. And that this sort of process, this recursive process of attending to how a representation, of first creating a representation, then attending to how it's been created, positions us relative to those representations to see how they've been created and provide, again, perspective. So bibliography, what is it? How might we think about it? The old way and the traditional way of sort of starting conversations like this is to look at the Greek and to recognize that bibliography has something to do with book writing, copying out books. If you look at its translation in the early 20th century into East Asian languages, it becomes this idea sort of loosely affiliated with writing records of books. So you're accounting for books. At its core, it has something to do with, again, copying and creating representations. So you create a representation, you then have to account for it. If you look at the etymology of the English word copy, it's actually quite interesting. You find that copy means abundance, fullness, plenitude. It's related to copious, the word copious. And of course, the sort of traditional notion of, and sort of more common notion of understanding copies as transcriptions or reproductions of some original. Copies are fantastically simple and complicated at the same time. They have to be separated by space and or time. So that word copy is not the same on the left as the one on the right. They had to be separated by space and time. They have to be distinct in that way, in the same way that the slide is distinct from the last one, because there was a little pause between them. And I tried to indicate that with the red time. So copies are separate and distinct from each other. They are transformations in the sort of root sense of the word transformation, in that they are a similar form taken across or somehow over to some other side. And in that process of movement, in that transformation, you have change. So copies are always about change. And at the same time, they can't be a copy if they're not somehow similar to what they're copying. So there's this interesting and fantastic dynamic between sort of similarity and similitude, and particularity and individuality. Copies are somehow similar for certain purposes. They have to be usefully similar, I would argue, along with Michael, to be called copies, but they're also particular. And so then the question becomes sort of who and what are they serving? What is the copy doing and for whom? What are the purposes and which context is it created? We get into all sorts of interesting hermeneutic and bibliographical questions. Other definitions of bibliography, one that I'm particularly fond of, is the notion that bibliography is the discipline that studies texts as recorded forms and the processes of their transmission, including their production and reception. And texts could be defined as verbal, visual, oral, and numeric, and I emphasize data. So data in these different kinds of forms. This is what bibliography attends to, according to what you might think of as sort of textual bibliographers, like D.F. Mackenzie here. There's a really wonderful and interesting sort of relationship right at about the same time that Mackenzie was formulating those kinds of ideas with regard to bibliography. We have Tepko Sarasevich defining information science in interestingly similar but also distinct ways. So the domain of information science is the transmission of the universe of human knowledge in recorded form, centering on the manipulation of information rather than knowing information. So representation, organization, and retrieval. We see that two very similar but distinct ways of looking at sort of recorded knowledge. So Patrick Wilson in 1968 came up with a wonderful way to sort of start to organize this. He described list makers and studiers of texts when he described bibliography in his famous Two Kinds of Power, his essay on bibliographical control. He talked about list makers, and these were people who were enumerating and describing things, and studiers of texts. And so he was thinking, and this gets us to the bridge between sort of information science and the humanities, or at least one of them. For Wilson, the list makers were basically the information scientists. They were the librarians and people in information science. And the studiers of texts were the sort of textual critics. They were the people in the humanities who were going and trying to figure out how bindings worked and books were produced and so on and so forth. My formulation of bibliography sort of fuses those two together to suggest that bibliography has something to do with the enumeration, the listing, the description, the analysis, and critique of copies. So what's enumerative bibliography? It's list making. You make a list of certain kinds of books, in this case, books of Korean poetry, or you can make lists of specific books. You can describe them. This is descriptive bibliography. You go through and you describe how the book was produced and where it was produced and which types of fonts were used. Analytical bibliography gets into kind of the machinery of producing books. In this case, in early 20th century Korea, the machines that were used, the types and how they were formulated. And critical bibliography has something to do with how you do the copying. You take this old book of Korean poetry, you realize it's really famous, but it's got all sorts of slightly different kinds of copies of the same text. You track those differences into and how they've been used and put forward in critical editions that get sent out to students to study and so on and so forth. So systematic, descriptive, analytical, and critical bibliography are integral to practices, I would argue, in again, our broad field of information science, and they serve as infrastructure. So what do I mean? To keep things a little bit simple and to keep on time, I want to focus in specifically on the list makers, enumerative and descriptive sort of bibliography on information science. So classically, we can look at cataloging and notice that we have copies again. So here we have a catalog description of a book. We see it in MARC format. We see it in BibFrame formats. We have 3 different basically copies of a copy of a description of a book. So we have copies being made so that you are serving information retrieval. Right, these copies are being created so that you could find the book that you're looking at. To find those books, you transform that original text. You create a description, you transform it so that you can take it across to some other place and get back to the book that you're looking for. So in this particular context, bibliography is sort of serving as infrastructure for information retrieval. It's serving library users. It's making it so you can find books, and it's in a kind of a library context. But you could also put it in a sort of information theory context. Take Claude Shannon's very, very famous notion of how information should be calculated. And notice that what he's doing is he's describing on the left side, enumerating and then describing what all the possible cases of a message might be. He's then doing some math and sort of analysis of the channel through which that might go, and then trying to figure out how he might need to add to often that message so that the message arrives in a similar enough form on the other side, a copy, therefore, on the other side to be a message that's received. So information, so bibliography in this case serving information theory as opposed to cataloging. And we have, of course, so many different ways to copy. And they're so intricately woven into all the different social issues that we care about and are involved in. For example, here in Korea, some of the examples that I look at, when South Korea went through a huge financial crisis in the 1990s, that was dubbed the IMF crisis because the IMF helped to bail out South Korea. What happened was they took a lot of people who got thrown out of work and had them started copying old texts. And this is actually where we get some of our digital texts, a lot of our digital texts of historical documents from Korea is from this period because people were made to copy texts. Copies, like I said, demand copies. There's this recursive sort of repetition of once you have a copy, you need to then account for the copy, and then you need to account for the copy of the copy, and then on it goes. So bibliography and copies sort of demanding an accounting. When you look at the word accounting, there's this wonderful old meaning of it, which means to render a reckoning. It's analysis. You're reckoning with what you have so that you can think about how to produce it elsewhere. And it entails counting again and enumerating and so on and so forth. What should be included, what should be excluded. And so as a sort of example of this, if you go and actually trying to find the book that's being described by that card catalog, what do you get? More copies, more copies of that book, reiterations of that metadata, and so on and so forth. So in this sense, I'm arguing that bibliography is infrastructural. It's baked into a lot of the things that we do as means serving all sorts of different kinds of ends. It's embedded, it's transparent, it's hard to see. It has immense reach and scope. It's learned as part of membership, and so on and so forth. It serves in that way as infrastructure. Copies and accounting for them serve deep learning in the very humanistic sense of people acquiring knowledge. You have Paul Pelliot in a cave in China, rediscovering copies of Buddhist texts and then copying them out again. And of course, copies and accounting for copies are deeply ingrained in the other kinds of deep learning we often talk about in information science these days, automated pattern recognition. So deep learning basically is a series of copies. So convolutional, just taking sort of one example of deep learning, convolutional neural networks, the convolutions are basically functions for how to copy an original out so that you can copy it and copy it and copy it and then network it to figure out which part of an image, for example, helps to describe a car or a character. You have these methods of copying where you have what's called a filter or a kernel sort of go over an image and transform it so that you get a new kind of copy. A usefully similar something else that serves as a copy. So big data and deep learning are copies, a little bit like turtles, all the way down. It's copies of copies of copies of copies. So what can be gained by reconsidering bibliography as a foundation of information science? Perspective. again, by means of being able to position and reposition ourselves in relation to what's been represented and how we might account for it. We can think about the really flawed and big problems of related to machine learning from a new perspective. When we recognize that facial recognition works great if you're white and a guy, we can understand that these new sort of assertions are basically bibliographical. And we have tools for understanding how bibliography works. We understand how documents can be biased. And machine learning is just another version of complex, yes, but still bibliographical representation. OpenAI, everyone's talking about OpenAI these days. Same thing. If you look at how they build their models and what they're doing, basically it's a lot of enumeration, a lot of description, and a lot of very controlled analysis and critique along the lines of very broadly along the lines of what Shannon had in mind in terms of creating representations in two different places. We as information scientists with a humanistic bent can also, of course, and would like to think about how the enumeration is done, how the description is really happening, how might we analyze what's going on differently, how might we critique it. So with this in mind, hoping to have stress tested the idea that reconsidering bibliography as a foundation of information science can help to account for the ways that we in information science and information tools are being used to assert truth, affect beliefs, and instantiate knowledge in these very complicated and evolving socio-technical and cultural systems that we're creating. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Wayne. The audience will appreciate that a detailed explanation of all that would take a book-length manifesto. I gather it won't be available till the new year. So
spring 2024, they tell me.
In attempting to back onto schedule, we'll turn now to Luciana Cortes Mendes from Brazil. Luciana is a librarian in a public library in Brazil, but she's also an instructor in library and information science. And she, not long ago, finished a very intelligent, thoughtful doctoral dissertation on the relevance of hermeneutics and phenomenology to information science. She wrote it in Portuguese, but in order to avoid you all learning Portuguese, she's now going to give largely a summary of that. So take us forwards, please, Luciana.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, everyone. I'll just share my screen now. So similarly to what David has spoken about, I'm gonna expound on this idea of how hermeneutics can serve as a foundation for a meta-theory of information science. So hermeneutics is concerned with the manner in which human beings find themselves in the world and how they can understand the world to act upon it. So according to Palmer, it's a phenomenological explanation of human existing itself. So basically here, when we talk about hermeneutics in the sense about philosophical hermeneutics, we're talking about how human beings exist. It's different from using it as a method for something. It's about existing itself. So from the thought of Heidegger and Gadamer that David has already briefly introduced, we have this concept by Heidegger, developed by Heidegger, of the design, which is the particularly human way of existing. So this particularly human way of existing, it's very interesting for us in information science because it guides how we can see a human being looking for information, having a certain information behavior, and being an information professional from this perspective of the design. So what exactly entails this design, this particularly human way of existing? It's being in the world. So everyone exists in the world in a certain way, a world that is already there. So we have to exist within this context, a context that was built for many generations, and we have to make sense of it when we come to it. We have to build who we are and exist within it. So it is being in context, is a context that is historical, that is cultural, that all of these things have to be taken into consideration. It's also being with. So I am not existing alone in this world. I'm existing with a vastly enormous number of other human beings who are also design. They are also this in their existence, that is being in the world and being with. And this being with is what starts creating all this context of the world. So everything of culture, everything we have been building of meaning come from this being in the world that is a being with other people. And something that's very important, it's the concept that Heidegger calls of thrownness, because we are thrown into this world. We are born and we are thrown into this world that already exists. It has a previous existence itself with other people, with all these aspects that make existence. And we have to make sense, we have to find meaning in that world. We are born, and of course, we start learning from our parents, from our families, from school, a lot of different ways of understanding the world, meanings, different, a whole lot of meanings. And we are thrown and we have to make meaning on our own. From all of those other meanings, we also have to make our own meaning, to give meaning to our own existence, to our own design. So how exactly can a human, an existence, a design make sense of itself within this world that he's thrown into? Through understanding and interpretation. Understanding for Heidegger is basically, we come to it to understand something from interpreting things. So that's basically why he talks about this existence being hermeneutical, because it is about interpreting. We go about the world interpreting it to make sense of it, to understand it, so that we can act upon this world. And this process of understanding is something that is called the hermeneutic circle. So to understand, to interpret, we need to go on this circle of interpretation. So if we go to how Gadamer explains the circle, he says we started with a projection. So it's an expectation of meaning from preceding context, because we have something, an understanding of something, and we project what we expect of meaning from that context. So if we're dealing with information, that would be the same thing. I have a book, I have an article, I have something. I expect it to mean something, not because I know, because it's maybe something new that I'm interpreting, but because I always approach something expecting something from it, for it to have some sort of meaning. And this projection must be corrected as required, because we come in contact with something, and despite the fact we have this expectation of meaning, it may come about or it may not. The meaning may change, it may transform as I go along and I deal more with it, I go deeper in something. So every revision of the project has the potentiality of itself projecting a new design. Every time I reveal something from this interpretation, I can have a new project, a new projection with a new expectation of meaning, which is why it's a circle, why it's a hermeneutic circle. And it's very clear for us to see this when we come into contact with a book or an article that I read something 10 years ago and I read the same thing now, and I have a new meaning for it. I have a new expectation and a new projection that I go building and making new meaning, and I can use it so that I can make sense of the world and act upon the world. So Gadamer says that interpretation begins with 4 concepts that are replaced by more suitable concepts, because we always have some concept as we go along living in our thrones, in our being with, in our being in the world, we go building concepts, and we always have some 4 concepts. And when you learn something, because we interact with it, we are constantly interpreting, we are replacing those concepts with more suitable concepts that give another meaning, a more full, more complete meaning to something. So there is this constant redesigning, which is constitutive of the back and forth of meaning in understanding and interpreting. So there is, that's why he uses the image of the circle, because we go back and forth in this understanding, in this complex situation of making sense of what something is. And this is always contextual, historical, and cultural. We always see something from a perspective that has to do with who we are, because we are people that are in a context that is very complex, with many multiple layers that make who we are, which is why we always go with this 4 concept, with 4 understanding, so that we can actually make the new understanding and the new meaning when we are interpreting. So when we understand that, we can see how information behavior is really related to this concept of design, of this perspective, this hermeneutical perspective. So here I'm using Wilson's definition that human behavior is the totality of human behavior in relation to sources and channels of information, including both active and passive information seeking and information use. So when we see how humans behave in this hermeneutical perspective, we are seeing how we are interacting constantly with information. As David said, we are always dealing with interpretation when we deal with information. So if we are actively searching for information, or if it's passive because something comes for us and we are dealing with information because it is information, we are dealing, we have a behavior that is interpretative. So we have to deal in our design with that. So it's important for us to think about information, or what we think about information within information science. So here I'm using the definition by Michael Buckland of information as process, as knowledge, and as thing, focusing here within information science and information as thing. So as objects, as materiality, something that's material that can give us, serve as evidence of something, give us meaning of something, so that we can actually come in contact with it, interpret it, so that we can go to do something with it in our lives, be it for to solve a problem or to just, live our lives in any other aspect. And I think it's particularly important as here as the tradition of documents, the documentation tradition, it brings something that can be a lot related to what we are dealing in hermeneutics. All of this perspective of what is a document, this tradition of documentation. So information behavior from a hermeneutics perspective, now what we think about, what can I conclude about it? So since understanding is the fundamental mode of being, human beings will interpret the informative entity, which is the document we come in contact with. So we are always interpreting, going through the process of the hermeneutic circle with documents. And when human beings actively engage themselves with the document, it is their strong condition, the necessity to face any circumstances in which they find themselves in and that may appear in their path, that leads them to search for and use a document. So when I am actively engaging with the document, searching for something, I am in mind as design, making sense of the world. I need to make sense of the world when I am design. That's how I live. That's my mode of existence, interpreting things. So this process, this information behavior is seen as hermeneutical. Hermeneutics also brings some aspects when you think about the document storage, organization, and retrieval, because these are all ways in which documents are managed to be retrieved and used by individuals. So if we consider that the activities developed by information professionals, which are themselves designed, being in the world, being with, which find themselves in a current condition, we see how this person, this design, is gonna go through all of this process, all of these activities, making interpretations, understanding, going through this constant interpretation with the four concepts, making new meanings, understanding things all over and all over again. Therefore, the activities developed by information professionals are based on understanding and interpretation. Everything we do is based on that. So when you do community analysis and needs assessment, we are doing a hermeneutical process to understand that community from our understanding of what that is and learning more about it to understand better so that we can provide the service. Collection development, the same thing. We have the information about the community, we have information about books, about databases, about everything we can provide as information, resources, as documents. And we have to go on this hermeneutic circle, making what we have as of resources and when we know about our community work together. When you deal with documentary analysis and representation, when we are cataloging, when we're indexing, classifying, everything we do is hermeneutical. We have four concepts when it comes to a book, when it comes to an article, and we are interpreting and we are representing according to what we are, to what we understand, to our context. And we are constantly changing, which is why sometimes a person may index something in a way, and in 5 years' time or in 3 months, it will be indexed in a different way, despite the fact we have guidelines and everything. Things change, and how we see them is a process that is always moving, always changing. When you go to make a search for a document where we retrieve something, the reference service, questions of relevance, all of them are related to hermeneutics. We have here to deal with the design of the professional and the design of the user, and how we can understand the question of reference that we have to deal with so that we can help our user. We are always dealing with this complex process of the hermeneutic circle. And even infrastructure, if we think when we are doing something about our service, we have to build something, we have to understand, to interpret. With all of this process, all of these things that are always related, we have to interpret. So when we choose a building, when we choose a software, when we choose something, we have to interpret. We have to make sense of everything within this context, or within our design as professionals, and taking in consideration what it means to be this hermeneutic person, this hermeneutic professional. So in conclusion, I believe that philosophical hermeneutics provides a theoretical framework of reference for the development of a meta-theory of information science. Because as we can see, from all these elements, from information behavior to how we act as information professionals, we are dealing with this mode of existence that is interpretative, as Heidegger and Gadamer put it. And I'd just like to acknowledge the Brazilian Coordinating Office for the Advancement of Higher Education and the Brazilian National Council for Scientific and Technological Development for 2 grants for my PhD that allowed me to do this research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luciana. I should explain to the audience that this session was Luciana's original idea, so she deserves credit for that. Now we have about 20 minutes available for discussion and comments. I invite anybody in the audience to raise their hands or to jump in, and preferably to direct their questions, if they can, to one or other of the speakers. I would like to just comment first that we have these three quite different speakers from three different continents, all bringing a rather unorthodox approach to information science, and yet it seems to me quite convergent. So do we have any questions or comments from the audience? And would any of the speakers like to comment or contribute in relation to the other presentations? Put your questions in the chat or raise your hand.
Mine is, sorry, that was me. So mine is just to thank, I think this is really a fascinating look at, information science as a whole and what the field's identity will look like in the age of AI and data science, right? So we need to listen to these perspectives so that we can have, better theories, better models, and I appreciate all your all the presenters and Professor Buckland for leading this. So my question, if I'm allowed to ask a question, is to really think ways we can take this message to a different audience. I think we in the information science community, whether you are attending an ASIS annual meeting or iConference, I think we get it, we understand. So how do we take it to, let's say, policymakers, right? So they think who are chasing the shiny object that is AI and ChatGPT. So how do you break through? Because it's important for policymakers, for politicians, and not just researchers to hear this. Thank you.
Do any of the speakers wish to respond to that?
I'll give it a go. It's a fantastic question because in some respects, we're way up in the clouds here, right? I mean, it's pretty theoretical and pretty philosophical. At least for me, the opportunity of thinking about bibliography as a kind of core infrastructure in information science is that we know about books. People know about books in general. They have a sense for how they're made. They have a sense for how they're read. They have a sense that they're interpreted. And so by recasting something like ChatGPT as just another kind of book, a very weird and new book that we aren't quite sure how to read yet, I mean, some of us know better than others how to read it, but the idea is that if you can explain to someone who is thinking about policy and how to regulate or think about ChatGPT and what kinds of impacts it's going to have, if you can explain what it is in terms that are already familiar, in terms of documents and books and things like that, that we're more likely to be able to explain some of its great powers and also some of its great dangers. And so as a sort of, that's my initial thought to your very, very good question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wayne. I think
I would like to add a variation on that. It seems to me that these three speakers have made a compelling case that hermeneutics and phenomenology and these long words from the humanities are plausible candidates for reconstructing, improving, clarifying information science. But that's only a first step. That sort of gets the foot inside the door. I think that what is going to be needed is actual worked examples of how long-standing problems and vagueness and uncertainties, both in the theory and the practice of information science, can be made more clear or offering remedies than has been possible with up till now. For example, Luciana was very eloquent on the hermeneutic cycle, that everything is changing, unstable all the time. Well, that's totally incompatible, or rather certainly different from the long-term assumption about static states of knowledge. It's a different view. And I think that it's going to be necessary for people like our speakers to actually work through some puzzling problems in order to justify this approach. And I think that the paper that Wayne referred to, which I helped with on copy theory, is an example. Now, Nadia had a hand up. Nadia, would you like to join in? Is Nadia Keda? Can you hear me?
Michael, it must have been a mistake. I must have raised it by mistake. I'm paying attention. Sorry about that.
Okay. Any other non-mistakes?
Yes, Michael, I think I wanted to follow up on your excellent point. I think that is what exactly I was saying, is that how do we communicate to a different kind of audience, right? Because I'm thinking of somebody putting together a team for an NSF proposal, right? So it is on AI, and would they think of somebody working in these areas, or somebody working on algorithms, machine learning and all that? So, but if we can get them to understand that actually their project would be better and richer if you include someone from this area. So that's where I'm really interested in your opinions, because in this day and age, especially those of us in academia, we need to look, go out and get that money, but you're competing in a space where people are giving money to those who show some shiny objects. So that's what yeah.
Yeah. I like to have some comments about this interesting question put forward by
Yep.
I'm not sure whether
my name is easy to spell but not easy to pronounce, so I understand.
Yeah. I think policymakers are like in the universities of government, they usually attach great importance to some tangible benefits of investments on information technology or information systems. Some soft approaches or soft science areas like humanities or humanities, because their values or benefits are not very easily directly shown to these policymakers. So sometimes this kind of research gets much less funding from policymakers or university administrations, and sometimes they are in danger of closing schools or something like that. So it has all disadvantages. But I think as the society progress, as the digital society progress, the importance of information ethics, data ethics, and data philosophy, and also including humanities and its implication for information science, will be gradually realized by these policy makers and university administration, and the situation we will change better and better, yeah, in the future.
Thank you, David. Yeah.
I might add that I think convincing people in positions of power now that thinking about AI as a form of bibliography is a really tough sell. That's going to be a very uphill battle. But I think so that at some level for the next little while those people are in power might be very difficult, and we just kind of have to keep doing our best. But if we're going to try and change this in the future, I think we look toward education and thinking about ways that we can show people who are getting into information science, who are students learning about AI, that these are bibliographical processes. If we can get those ideas set early on in a student's career, then later the kinds of arguments that we're attempting to make are likely to land better. So I'm not sure how to solve the problem in the immediate context, but if we wish to solve it over the long term, that might be one way to go about it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. We can, at least our students, we know we have, we interact with them on a daily, weekly basis, right? So politicians and the funding agencies may be a difficult task. So.
I think the solution to what Habibi wants is a really difficult one, but you can't command respect or attention. You can only earn it. And this means that you've either got to be engaged with really interesting problems that other people find interesting from outside, or you've got to be coming up with better solutions. And I think also we are at risk of being hindered by too much discussion of disciplines and fields. I think it's a terrible mistake to think of this field as interdisciplinary. It is to occupy rhetorically a very poor place. We should say we are methodologically versatile. We will use whatever tools we can because we're dealing with a really important problem, and that is that ignorance in society is a really bad idea. And anything we can do on that is likely to be applauded, and you can't predict what tool you'll need. You just want to be open to all of them. And my sense is that either in dealing with funding agencies that have a lot of money, like the National Science Foundation, or the brutal environment of a serious research university, you'd better choose problems that are interesting and or important, and not just follow what's fashionable. That's how you earn your keep. That's how you have an interesting life, and that's how you'll feel good about it when you retire. That's my 2 cents worth. Now, I thought I saw another.
No, that's a great point. Yeah, thank you.
Any more comments or suggestions? Or one more thing on the interdisciplinary. I have the feeling that we should regard interdisciplinary borrowing in a very neutral sense. And I think I'm going to make a list of examples where interdisciplinary borrowings have been detrimental to the field. For example, it used to be orthodox that information is by definition true. This is total nonsense outside of a narrow little set of logic, which is only a tiny part of knowledge and understanding. And some borrowings are good and valuable and useful, and others should be treated with more skepticism. So anybody who's got candidates for such a list, send them to me. By the way, the speakers' email addresses are in the program, so you can do that. I see a hand from Sheila. Go ahead, Sheila.
Yes. Yes, so thank you for, I'm afraid I missed the start. We're moving buildings and I'm trying to clear up my office, and we had our kind of farewell social thing, which coincided with the start of the session, but I was here for most of the papers. It was just to say that I feel rather pessimistic about getting information and library professionals, information science professionals and researchers recognized in the big policy conversations, and taking the example of misinformation and disinformation, and how some of the international initiatives, for example, from the World Health Organization, didn't include information people in their initial kind of conversations. They included historians and sociologists, and political scientists, and very quickly a discipline has grown up of misinformation studies. I was thinking about the, perhaps I'm just in a cynical mood because I've been going through so much old material, and, but I was thinking that some of these people, I'm not sure that, or researchers, I'm not sure they have earned their place or kind of at the ears of people of power, but by clamoring or by just being assertive, or using social media channels better or networking better, they do seem to have put their kind of value forward more convincingly than people in information science. I encourage my students to be assertive and not to be too pessimistic, but I must say I feel kind of rather depressed about it and feel I ought to be doing more about it. In that it doesn't seem, certainly with the UK government, it doesn't seem necessarily a matter of having the good arguments or putting forward what seems a very obvious good thing that would be an outcome. Yeah.
I would suggest that one thing that should be done more, and I'm guilty of lacking in this myself, and that is publishing outside of the information science journals. Almost certainly whatever you write that's worth publishing can be seen as a different topic if viewed from a different perspective. So if you talk about the bibliography of information science, you certainly ought to publish in bibliography as well as information science, and so on. And it's likely to be individual contributions and individual writers that'll get recognition rather than the discipline. It seems to me that the world doesn't come naturally with fences. It's an undulating landscape. It's not an archipelago of islands. And you have to be willing to roam wherever you need to go. The fences and disciplines and barriers, they're imposed socially for various political and economic and organizational reasons.
Sheila, one of the things that came to mind as you were talking, as David and Luciano were speaking also, I would think of the stuff that I'm working on too as similar. A lot of the things that we're dealing with are so crucial, but they're also so common. Interpretation is so basic, right? Of course, we're interpreting things all the time and writing things down and then trying to account for what we've written down is really just a core basic function of things that everybody does in different kinds of contexts. And I wonder if part of the problem isn't that those are so core and so basic that they almost go unnoticed, which makes it hard for us to sort of say, hey, this is really important. And even if you make it, all the great arguments about how important these things are, because they're so fundamental to what we're doing already, they seem to just sort of slip out of mind for the shinier thing, the new thing, AI and all the rest. Even if people don't recognize it, it's an extension of what we've been doing for a very, very, very long time, just in a kind of new shape.
Oh, Okay, well, on that inspiring note, well, let's move this discussion forward at the annual meeting. And I'll
Yes.
pass the baton over, or microphone over to BB.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. I was going to debate you on the fences one, but I'm going to pass. So we'll continue in London. I actually like what you said, but in reality, those fences are in place in so many places. People are scared of publishing outside their, recommended journals. So we'll continue this conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Buckland. Thank you, everybody. Hello, everyone. Those of you whom I've not met, yep, thank you, Professor Katie. I've not met, my name is Abubakar Risa, and as I have always said, I have the pleasure of serving as the president of this fine association, ASIS. As I said repeatedly, ASIS is a global association now. You can even see in the attendees this week, you all came from 32 countries. That is amazing for a media conference. So I'm really encouraged, and I hope to see more of you in London. I hope to do that. So with this excellent panel discussion that we just had, we concluded the program for the 2023 ASIS Media Conference. I hope you enjoyed the conference as much as I did, although I'm on very few hours of sleep, and some of you are as well. At this year's conference, we had 4 days of very rich, robust, and interactive presentations and discussions around wide-ranging and current topics and issues relevant to us as scholars, practitioners, researchers, and the communities we serve. We also had excellent keynote and invited talks by leading scholars in the field. Professor Abriza Abdullah kicked off the media keynote talks on Monday for some of us and Tuesday for some of you, with a fascinating look at scholarly publishing and how to make it work for all while moving from visibility to inclusivity. That was followed by Professor Nadia Katie's engaging talk on knowledge translation and relevance, with great examples of what engaged research and knowledge translation looks like. I really enjoyed all the talks. And today, we had a chance to hear from Professor Noura Hirvonen. I was driving while she was talking. I know it was great, on a topic that is on everyone's mind these days: artificial intelligence in everyday information practices. In between the keynote talks, we also had 78 presenters making 50 presentations. We also had 133 individuals attending the conference, representing, as I said, 32 countries. I hope you agree with me that the conference has been a success, and that everyone from our presenters, including our esteemed keynote speakers, co-chairs, and members of the conference planning committee, reviewers, sometimes we forget to thank reviewers, manuscript reviewers, and ASIS staff. If you're here, Kathy, Lydia, Pam, Kim, Amenta, and Garrett, hats off to you. So really, really grateful for everything you do. And everyone else who contributed to the conference, you all played critical roles and important roles. And it had been a true team effort. Therefore, one more time, please give yourselves, committee members, and ASIS staff a huge round of applause. You can do it through virtually or yes. The ASIS staff, the co-chairs, Hima and Iman, I don't know if you're here. I know I saw Hima here. And several members of the planning committee had very little sleep. I think Lydia woke up probably, or never slept all night. And I'm going to ask all of you to please not to email them for a couple of days, because they need very much needed sleep. So we now look forward to the ASIS annual meeting, as Professor Buckland said, at the end of October. I have no doubt that we will see you and many more to continue these rich and great conversations we started here at this conference. We can't wait to see you in London in a few months. Thank you again. Wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, or good night. Kathy or Lydia, do you have any housekeeping last minute?
We will be sending an evaluation out later today or tomorrow.
Yes.
Please complete that.
Yes.
And thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Thank you, everyone. It was great seeing you all. Yep.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.